231 is where we are, isn't it?
Indeed.
Who would like to read?
I'll start reading a little bit and then I'll pass it on to somebody else. Excuse me. A negotiation often becomes necessary for shaping concrete paths to peace. Yet the processes of change that lead to lasting peace are crafted above all by peoples. Each individual can act as an effective leaven by the way he or she lives each day. Great changes are not produced behind desks or in offices. This means that everyone has a fundamental role to play in a single great creative project, to write a new page of history, a page full of hope, peace, and reconciliation. There is an architecture of peace to which different institutions of society contribute, each according to its own area of expertise. But there is also an art of peace that involves us all. From the various peace processes that have taken place in different parts of the world, we have learned that these ways of making peace, of placing reason above revenge, of the delicate harmony between politics and law, cannot ignore the involvement of ordinary people. Peace is not achieved by normative frameworks and institutional arrangements between well-meaning political or economic groups. It is always helpful to incorporate into our peace processes the experience of those sectors that have been overlooked, so that communities themselves can influence the development of a collective memory. Going further, there is no end to the building of a country's social peace. Rather, it's an open-ended endeavor, a never-ending task that demands the commitment of everyone and challenges us to work tirelessly to build the unity of the nation. Despite obstacles, differences, and varying perspectives on the way to achieve peaceful coexistence, this task summons us to persevere in the struggle to promote a culture of encounter. This requires us to place at the center of all political, social, and economic activity the human person who enjoys the highest dignity and respect for the common good. May this determination help us flee from the temptation for revenge and the satisfaction of short-term partisan interests. Violent public demonstrations on one side or the other do not help in finding solutions, mainly because, as the bishops of Columbia have rightly noted, the origins and objectives of civil demonstrations are not always clear. Certain forms of political manipulation are present, and in some cases that have been exploited for partisan interests. So moving forward, beginning with the least. Building social friendship does not only call for rapprochement between groups who took different sides of some troubled period of history, but also for a renewed encounter with the most impoverished and vulnerable sectors of society. For peace is not merely absence of war, but a tireless commitment, especially on the part of those of us charged with greater responsibility, to recognize, protect, and concretely restore the dignity so often overlooked or ignored of our brothers and sisters, so that they can see themselves as the principal protagonists of the destiny of their nation. Well, there's certainly a lot to consider in that, in all of that.
Back in the other paragraph, I was thinking, I wonder why he chose Colombia as an example. I thought he might have chosen Venezuela.
Colombia has been dealing, if I'm not mistaken, with right-wing groups for 10 plus years. They just recently been able to resolve that issue. In fact, the gentleman that did that, I think, got the Nobel Peace Prize for it, if I'm not mistaken.
Thank you.
But I think it certainly draws attention, excuse me, to what our country has been through over the past several months. You know, and the difficulty of trying to resolve the differences that certainly exist, and even now the hatred that's being fomented against Asian Americans is very sad to witness.
Disgusting.
I was surprised and disappointed in the way, amidst the last shooting, this horrible incident in Colorado, how different groups, city, county, state, and all of the gun control that had been in place, and they found it to be something that they couldn't control, and it had to go back to a national scope when the ban on assault rifles in Colorado had been working. And it's interesting how the different levels of government just seem to not be able to get along, agree. And what ends up is either bad things happen or nothing happens at all to promote the welfare of individuals. I was really caught by that when I was listening to part of that news broadcast about Colorado. So it's so difficult to find agreement or to be able to move forward on some items. And I don't know why that has to be so hard.
I think a troubling aspect for me in doing not a lot, but a little bit of reading on the current violence against Asian Americans is that when you look at some online distributions of news, a lot of that is coming from sources that can't be held accountable for what they're saying and what they're professing regarding Asian Americans and linking them to the coronavirus. And it troubles me that people are able to just put out there anything that they would like, or to kind of craft public opinion without accountability. We've talked about in the past, we've talked about the Fairness Doctrine, which was eliminated during Reagan's presidency, which required news sources to present both sides of an issue. And since that's gone away, you don't have the accountability to, news sources are not required to be accountable for what they say. But even so, the going on in the internet world is even worse. People are able to say pretty much anything they want, and if they can find a following and they can find people whose views match theirs, then they can create a following that can't be, what's the word I'm looking for? Can't be, I don't want to say stopped, but there's no discernment as to whether those views are true or not.
Right. No fact check. I'm dismayed by the many different venues in our society where fact checking would make an enormous, powerful difference, and it just isn't done. Even in trials, I mean, I had that issue in trials that I've been involved with where they're, when they give their arguments, the prosecutor and the defender are allowed to say whatever they want. There's no restriction, there's no fact checking. And I mean, the voter pamphlets, where they give arguments pro and con, but nobody knows who's telling the truth. They say the opposite things and you don't know. So that's something that I wish that we could do a lot more of in our society in general, is just have ways in which when anything is being made public or when it's being presented to a body, that there could be some kind of, like you were saying, Phil, I don't know what those laws actually, or what that law actually used to control and then it stopped. I'm not familiar with it.
Phil, when you related the activities against Asian Americans, are you linking that to the start of the COVID, that it may have begun in China? You think that's related?
I think some people have publicly said that.
Okay.
I read a little bit of an Atlantic article, an article in the Atlantic that was saying that in like the QAnon distribution of information is beginning to pivot towards that kind of those kinds of activities and kind of fomenting violence towards Asian Americans because of the coronavirus, and saying that it came from China, and that blaming Asian Americans for bringing the virus here to America.
Okay.
Phil, I don't know if you heard me, but can you explain what the law that stopped? You mentioned that there was the Fairness Doctrine or a practice of some kind. I'm not familiar with it. Can you explain it to me?
I can't say much more about it other than it required news sources to give both sides of a story. PBS probably would be a good example of the Fairness Doctrine in play, because when they are interviewing on a particular news story, they'll have both sides, they'll have spokespeople for both sides of the issue talk to it. And it was called the Fairness Doctrine, and I think it was
Was
I
that an
think in
FCC
1987.
regulation?
Pardon?
I'm sorry. Was it an FCC regulation? I was trying to
Yes.
where
I don't remember. Whatever group is the group that handles communications nationwide.
yeah, I think that's the FCC.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I didn't know about it.
Going on, 234. Often the more vulnerable members of society are victims of unfair generalizations. If at times the poor and the dispossessed react with attitudes that appear antisocial, we should realize that in many cases, those reactions are born of history of scorn and social exclusion. The Latin American bishops have observed that only the closeness that makes us friends can enable us to appreciate deeply the values of the poor today, their legitimate desires, and their own manner of living the faith. The option for the poor should lead us to friendship with the poor. Let's see, moving on, 235, and then this is the last paragraph I'll read. Those who work for tranquil social coexistence should never forget that inequality and the lack of integral human development make peace impossible. Indeed, without equal opportunities, different forms of aggression and conflict will find a fertile terrain for growth and eventually explode. When a society, whether local, national, or global, is willing to leave a part of itself on the fringes, no political programs or resources spent on law enforcement or surveillance systems can indefinitely guarantee tranquility. If we have to begin anew, it must always be from the least of our brothers and sisters. Okay. If somebody else can read.
The value and meaning of forgiveness. There are those who prefer not to talk of reconciliation, for they think that conflict, violence, and breakdown are part of the normal functioning of a society. In any human group, there are always going to be more or less subtle power struggles between the different parties. Others think that promoting forgiveness means yielding ground and influence to others. For this reason, they feel it is better to keep things as they are, maintaining a balance of power between differing groups. Still others believe that reconciliation is a sign of weakness, incapable of serious dialogue. They choose to avoid problems by ignoring injustices. Unable to deal with problems, they opt for an apparent peace. Inevitable conflict. Forgiveness and reconciliation are central themes in Christianity and in various ways in other religions. Yet there is a risk that an inadequate understanding and presentation of these profound convictions can lead to fatalism, apathy, and injustice, or even intolerance and violence. Jesus never promoted violence or intolerance. He openly condemned the use of force to gain power over others. Quote, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. It will not be so among you." Reference Matthew. Instead, the gospel tells us to forgive 70 times 7 and offers the example of the unmerciful servant who himself was forgiven, yet unable to forgive others in turn. Reading other texts of the New Testament, we can see how the early Christian communities living in a pagan world marked by widespread corruption and aberrations sought to show unfailing patience, tolerance, and understanding. Some texts are very clear in this regard. We are told to admonish our opponents with gentleness and encouraged to speak evil of no one, to avoid quarreling, to be gentle, and to show every courtesy to everyone. For we ourselves were once foolish. The Acts of the Apostles note that the disciples, albeit persecuted by some of the authorities, had favor with all the people. Yet when we reflect upon forgiveness, peace, and social harmony, we also encounter the jarring saying of Christ, "Do not think that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to set a man against his father, and a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and a man's foes will be members of his own household." These words need to be understood in the context of the chapter in which they are found, where it is clear that Jesus is speaking of fidelity to our decision to follow him. We are not ashamed of that. We are not to be ashamed of that decision, even if it entails hardships of various sorts. Even our loved ones refuse to accept it. Christ's word do not encourage us to seek conflict, but simply to endure it when it inevitably comes, lest deference to others for the sake of supposed peace in our families or society should detract from our own fidelity. St. John Paul II observed that the Church does not intend to condemn every possible form of social conflict. The Church is well aware that in the course of history, conflicts of interest between different social groups inevitably arise, and that in the face of such conflicts, Christians must take a position honestly and decisively. Somebody else can read now.
Legitimate conflict and forgiveness. Nor does this mean calling for forgiveness when it involves renouncing our own rights, confronting corrupt officials, criminals, or those who would debase our dignity. We are called to love everyone without exception. At the same time, loving an oppressor does not mean allowing him to keep oppressing us or letting him think that what he does is acceptable. On the contrary, true love for an oppressor means seeking ways to make him cease his oppression. It means stripping him of a power that he does not know how to use and that diminishes his own humanity and that of others. Forgiveness does not entail allowing oppressors to keep trampling on their own dignity and that of others, or letting criminals continue their wrongdoing. Those who suffer injustice have to defend strenuously their own rights and those of their family, precisely because they must preserve the dignity that they have received as a loving gift from God. If a criminal has harmed me or a loved one, no one can forbid me from demanding justice and ensuring that this person or anyone else will not harm me or others again. This is entirely just. Forgiveness does not forbid it, but actually demands it. Somewhere we'll probably adjust the measure of justice, but the important thing is not to fuel anger, which isn't healthy for our soul and the soul of our people, or to be obsessed with taking revenge and destroying the other. No one achieves inner peace and returns to a normal life in that way. The truth is that no family, no group of neighbors, no ethnic group, much less a nation, has a future if the force that unites them, brings them together, and resolves their differences is vengeance and hatred. We cannot come to terms and unite for the sake of revenge, or treating others with the same violence with which they treated us, or plotting opportunities for retaliation under apparently legal auspices. Nothing gained this way, and in the end, everything is lost. Comments? To be sure, it is no easy task to overcome the bitter legacy of injustices, hostility, and mistrust left by conflict. It can only be done by overcoming evil with good, and by cultivating those virtues which foster reconciliation, solidarity, and peace. In this way, persons who nourish goodness in their heart find that such goodness leads to a peaceful conscience and to profound joy, even in the midst of difficulties and misunderstandings. Even when afforded goodness is never weak, but rather shows its strength by refusing to take revenge. Each of us should realize that even the harsh judgment I hold in my heart against my brother or my sister, the open wound that was never cured, the offense that was never forgiven, the rancor that is only going to hurt me, are all instances of a struggle that I carry with me, a little flame deep in my heart that needs to be extinguished before it turns into a great blaze.
That's very well said.
It is.
Pretty difficult, challenging, well said, and very challenging.
The best way to move on. When conflicts are not resolved but kept hidden or buried in the past, silence can lead us to complicity in grave misdeeds and sins. Authentic reconciliation does not flee from conflict, but is achieved in conflict, resolving it through dialogue and open, honest, and patient negotiation. Conflict between different groups, if it abstains from enmities and mutual hatred, gradually changes into an honest discussion of differences founded on a desire for justice. On numerous occasions, I have spoken of a principle indispensable to the building of friendship in society, namely, that unity is greater than conflict. This is not to opt for a kind of syncretism or for the absorption of one into the other, but rather for a resolution that which takes place on a higher plane and preserves what is valid and useful on both sides. All of us know that when we, as individuals and communities, learn to look beyond ourselves and our particular interests, then understanding and mutual commitment bear fruit. In a setting where conflicts, tensions, and even groups once considered inimical can attain a multifaceted unity that gives rise to new life. Memory. Of those who've endured much unjust and cruel suffering, a sort of social forgiveness must not be demanded. Reconciliation is a personal act, and no one can impose it upon an entire society, however great the need to foster it. In a strictly personal way, someone, by a free and generous decision, can choose not to demand punishment, even if it's quite legitimately demanded by society and its justice system. However, it is not possible to proclaim a blanket reconciliation in an effort to bind wounds by decree or to cover injustices in a cloak of oblivion. Who can claim the right to forgive in the name of others? It is moving to see forgiveness shown by those who are able to leave behind them the harm they suffered. But it is also humanly understandable in the case of those who cannot. In any case, forgetting is never the answer.
I don't quite understand the last sentence. In any case, forgetting is never the answer. Is he thinking forgetting without reconciliation? Is that what he's driving at?
I think so.
I think he's saying forgetting without forgiveness is not the answer.
But it's insightful to me about his statements about blanket reconciliation in terms of some of the reparation issues we have floating in the US right now. And it kind of leads me to, I guess, a dialogue that ends, since I don't think reparation is necessary, that ends in a discussion, but not necessarily and anticipating that in some time, forgiveness on an individual basis will take place. They're going to say something about the Shoah. Anybody remember? Anybody know what the Shoah is?
Just a minute and I'll tell you.
Oh,
Say that again, Bob.
I'm sorry, was your question, what is the Shoah?
Yes.
That was the Holocaust.
Ah. I was wondering if that was in his mind. The Shoah must not be forgotten. It is the enduring symbol of the depth to which human evil can sink when spurred by false ideologies. It fails to recognize the fundamental dignity of each person, which merits unconditional respect regardless of ethnic origin or religious belief. As I think of it, I cannot help but repeat this prayer. Lord, remember us in your mercy. Grant us the grace to be ashamed of what we men have done, to be ashamed of this massive idolatry, of having despised and destroyed our own flesh, which you formed from the earth, to which you gave life with your own breath of life. Never again, Lord, never again. Nor must we forget the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Once again, I pay homage to all the victims and I bow before the strength and dignity of those who, having survived those first moments for years, have afterward borne in the flesh immense suffering and in their spirit seeds of death that drain their vital energy. We cannot allow present and future generations to lose the memory of what happened. It is the memory that ensures and encourages the building of a more fair and fraternal future. Neither must we forget the persecutions, the slave trade, and the ethnic killings that continue in various countries, as well as many other historical events that made us ashamed of our humanity. They need to be remembered, always and ever anew. We must never grow accustomed or inured to them.
That's pretty direct.
Yeah.
It probably needs to be said more often.
I'm kind of reminded of the movement. I haven't heard about it for a while that tried to deny that the Holocaust ever took place.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I guess, stuff like that resurfaces and maybe that's a way of reaffirming that it did. But
Point.
nowadays, it is easy to be tempted to turn the page, to say that all these things happened long ago and we should look to the future. For God's sake, no. We can never move forward without remembering the past. We do not progress without an honest and unclouded memory. We need to keep alive the flame of collective conscience, bearing witness to succeeding generations to the horror of what happened, because that witness awakens and preserves the memory of the victims, so that the conscience of humanity may rise up in the face of every desire for dominance and destruction. The victims themselves, individuals, social groups, or nations, need to do so, lest they succumb to the mindset that leads to justifying reprisals and every kind of violence in the name of the great evil endured. For this reason, I think not only of the need to remember the atrocities, but also all those who, amid such great inhumanity and corruption, retained their dignity and with gestures, small or large, chose the power of solidarity, forgiveness, and fraternity. To remember goodness is also a healthy thing. Would someone else like to read? Or I'll continue for a bit.
I can read a bit.
Okay, great.
Forgiving but not forgetting. Forgiving does not mean forgetting, or better, in the face of a reality that can in no way be denied, relativized, or concealed, forgiveness is still possible. In the face of an action that can never be tolerated, justified, or excused, we can still forgive. In the face of something that cannot be forgotten, for any reason, we can still forgive. Free and heartfelt forgiveness is something noble, a reflection of God's own infinite ability to forgive. If forgiveness is gratuitous, then it can be shown even to someone who resists repentance and is unable to beg pardon. Those who truly forgive do not forget. Instead, they choose not to yield to the same destructive force that caused them so much suffering. They break the vicious circle. They halt the advance of the forces of destruction. They choose not to spread in society the spirit of revenge that will sooner or later return to take its toll. Revenge never truly satisfies victims. Some crimes are so horrendous and cruel that the punishment of those who perpetrated them does not serve to repair the harm done. Even killing the criminal would not be enough. nor could any form of torture prove commensurate. The sufferings inflicted on the victim, revenge resolves nothing. This does not mean impunity. Justice is properly sought solely out of love of justice itself, out of respect for the victims as a means of preventing new crimes and protecting the common good, not as an alleged outlet for personal anger. Forgiveness is precisely what enables us to pursue justice without falling into a spiral of revenge or the injustice of forgetting. When injustices have occurred on both sides, it is important to take into clear account whether they were equally grave or in any way comparable. Violence perpetrated by the state using its structures and power is not on the same level as that perpetrated by particular groups. In any event, one cannot claim that the unjust sufferings of one side alone should be commemorated. The bishops of Croatia have stated that we owe equal respect to every innocent victim. There can be no racial, national, confessional, or partisan differences. I ask God to prepare our hearts to encounter our brothers and sisters so that we may overcome our differences rooted in political thinking, language, culture, and religion. Let us ask him to anoint our whole being with the balm of his mercy, which heals the injuries caused by mistakes, misunderstandings, and disputes. And let us ask him for the grace to send us forth in humility and meekness along the demanding but enriching path of seeking peace. War and the death penalty. There are two extreme situations that may come to be seen as solutions in especially dramatic circumstances, without realizing that they are false answers that do not resolve the problems they are meant to solve and ultimately do more than introduce new elements of destruction in the fabric of national and global society. These are war and the death penalty. The injustice of war. Deceit is in the mind of those who plan evil, but those who counsel peace have joy. Yet there are those who seek solutions in war, frequently fueled by a breakdown in relations, hegemonic ambitions, abuses of power, fear of others, and a tendency to see diversity as an obstacle. War is not a ghost from the past, but a constant threat. Our world is encountering growing difficulties on the slow path to peace upon which it had embarked and which had already begun to bear good fruit. Since conditions that favor the outbreak of wars and once again increasing, I can only reiterate that war is the negation of all rights and a dramatic assault on the environment. If we want true integral human development for all, we must work tirelessly to avoid war between nations and peoples. To this end, there is a need to ensure the uncontested rule of law and tireless recourse to negotiation, mediation, and arbitration, as proposed by the Charter of the United Nations, which constitutes truly a fundamental juridical norm. The 75 years since the establishment of the United Nations and the experience of the first 20 years of this millennium have shown that the full application of international norms proves truly effective and that failure to comply with them is detrimental. The Charter of the United Nations, when observed and applied with transparency and sincerity, is an obligatory reference point of justice and a channel of peace. Here, there can be no room for disguising false intentions or placing the partisan interests of one country or group above the global common good. If rules are considered simply as means to be used whenever it proves advantageous and to be ignored when it is not, uncontrollable forces are unleashed that cause grave harm to societies, to the poor and vulnerable, to fraternal relations, to the environment, and to cultural treasures with irretrievable losses for global community. Would anyone else like to take over?
I can jump back in.
Thank you.
War can easily be chosen by invoking all sorts of allegedly humanitarian, defensive, or precautionary excuses, and even resorting to the manipulation of information. In recent decades, every single war has been ostensibly justified. The Catechism of the Catholic Church speaks of the possibility of legitimate defense by means of military force, which involves demonstrating that certain rigorous conditions of moral legitimacy have been met. Yet it's easy to fall into an overly broad interpretation of this potential right. In this way, some would also wrongly justify even preventive attacks or acts of war that can hardly avoid entailing evils and disorders graver than the evil to be eliminated. At issue is whether the development of nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons and the enormous and growing possibilities offered by new technologies have granted war an uncontrollable destructive power over great numbers of innocent civilians. The truth is that never has humanity had such power over itself, yet nothing ensures that it will be used wisely. We can no longer think of war as a solution, because its risks will probably always be greater than its supposed benefits. In view of this, it is very difficult nowadays to invoke the rational criteria elaborated in earlier centuries to speak of the possibility of a just war. Never again war. Yeah, what is it? Is China, I think, is now selling drones, military drones, and they're pretty nice looking. But you know, the potential for for drone technology and I mean, just it could change warfare so greatly.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And you know, heaven forbid that we ever use CRISPR to create the perfect warrior. But it should be added that with increased globalization, what might appear as an immediate or practical solution for one part of the world initiates a chain of violent and often latent effects that end up harming the entire planet and opening the way to new and worse wars in the future. In today's world, there are no longer just isolated outbreaks of war in one country or another. Instead, we are experiencing a war fought piecemeal. Since the destinies of countries are so closely interconnected on the global scene. In the words of St. John the 23rd, it no longer makes sense to maintain that war is a fit instrument with which to repair the violation of justice. In making this point amid great international tension, he voiced a growing desire for peace emerging in the Cold War period. He supported the conviction that the arguments for peace are stronger than any calculation of the particular interest and confidence in the use of weaponry. The opportunities offered by the end of the Cold War were not, however, adequately seized due to a lack of vision for the future and a shared consciousness of our common destiny. Instead, it proved easier to pursue partisan interests without upholding the universal common good. The dread specter of war thus began to gain new ground.
This, what Pope Francis is talking about, excuse me, here, and covering these paragraphs, I'm finding it really difficult to get my head wrapped around everything that he's saying. I mean, in a way, it's pretty straightforward, but then you can think of instances where some kind of counter effort would be necessary, and it's hard to decide how to view that. I think maybe the most egregious example of that would be the Russians' hack of the software SolarWinds that so many companies are using. And they're saying that the Russian intrusion could be so deep in the software that it might never be could never be discovered. So you wonder how to counteract something, an activity that gets at the heart of our nation's commerce and even defense system. I mean, I just wonder how you counteract something like that. Kind of leaves an open question, and I'm not really sure how to resolve that.
But if you limit yourself to defense, isn't that part of the answer?
Say that again, Bob.
If you limit yourself to defense, isn't that part of the answer? Because I think what you suggest is that, you know, maybe we should, you know, do something aggressively.
Well, it's to do something. Let's take that as an example. That situation as an example. To begin with, there was no defense because they were able to hack the software. So there's no defense. There was no defense against it because it was unknown. It wasn't overt, but intrusive in a very subtle way. And rule of the rule of law, or the rule of justice would say that in order to, so what should our country's response be to that? Should we try to hack Russian software, or should we take other steps to so what I'm getting at, there needs to be a just response in my mind. And I'm not sure exactly what that just response is.
I think what you're saying is that retaliation as defense, you know, what Bob said and what you said, is that the only really effective way of defending?
I mean, there's in the areas of diplomacy, which is far beyond my you know, my pay grade, is there are just lots of little levers, and so, you know, it can be, you know, just you know, talking about it, or getting a bunch of people together to talk about it, or it could be, you know, changing some of the financial takes on it. Obviously, I think that part of our efforts against Russia has now been to discourage the pipeline that they're trying to build across, you know, kind of from Russia to Norway to Germany, because that'll enhance, you know, their sale of natural gas. So I think there's things like that, and but it's also I guess of you know responding to protect ourselves in terms of cybersecurity, because I mean once it's once the weapon's out there, then there's other people that will use it. Going on. Every war leaves our world worse than it was before. War is a failure of politics and of humanity, a shameful capitulation, a stinging defeat before the forces of evil. Let us not remain mired in theoretical discussions, but touch the wounded flesh of the victims. Let us look once more at all those civilians whose killing was considered collateral damage. Let us ask victims of themselves. Let us think of refugees and the displaced, those who suffered the effects of atomic radiation or chemical attacks, the mothers who lost their children, and the boys and girls maimed or deprived of their childhood. Let us hear the true stories of these victims of violence, look at reality through their eyes, and listen with an open heart to the stories they tell. In this way, we will be able to grasp the abyss of evil at the heart of a war, nor will it trouble us to be deemed naive for choosing peace.
I think he raises a really good point here. I think it's easy not to be emotionally involved in the violence against others until you actually hear their stories, and then have to become emotionally involved in their stories. I think that's where the changes can take place.
I've often kind of wondered about it would be so easy for us to go into Mexico and take care of the drug problem and militarily. But, there's a rule among nations that they won't invade each other and or do that kind of stuff. And so it causes its pause. But it's when I was wondering, when I kind of, not directly related to that, but I'm kind of wondering about whether it be proper intervention for us to create orphanages on the Mexico side of the border in order to hold the unescorted minors. And as a step to do something short of letting them into the country. But anyway.
'Tis a dilemma.
It is.
It's
Rules by themselves will not suffice if we continue to think that the solution to current problems is deterrence through fear or the threat of nuclear, chemical, or biological weapons. Indeed, if we take into consideration the principal threats to peace and security with their many dimensions in this multipolar world of the 21st century as, for example, terrorism, asymmetrical conflicts, cybersecurity, environmental problems, poverty, not a few doubts arise regarding the inadequacy of nuclear deterrence as an effective response to such challenges. These concerns are even greater when we consider the catastrophic humanitarian and environmental consequences that would follow from any use of nuclear weapons, with devastating, indiscriminate, and uncontainable effects over time and space. We need also to ask ourselves how sustainable is a stability based on fear, when it actually increases fear and undermines relationships of trust between peoples. International peace and stability cannot be based on false sense of security, on the threat of mutual destruction or total annihilation, or simply maintaining the balance of power. In this context, the ultimate goal of the total elimination of nuclear weapons becomes both a challenge and a moral and humanitarian imperative. Growing interdependence and globalization mean that any response to the threat of nuclear weapons should be collective and concerted, based on mutual trust. This trust can be built only through dialogue that is truly directed to the common good, and not to the protection of veiled or particular interests. With the money spent on weapons and other military expenditures, let us establish a global fund that can finally put an end to hunger and favor development in the most impoverished countries, so that their citizens will not resort to violent or illusory solutions, or have to leave their countries in order to seek a more dignified life.
And that's a good place to stop for this week.